That's awesome. Thank you, Kelly. First off, welcome everyone. I mean, this is an awesome audience for this particular discussion, which I think is pretty awesome. It's pretty awesome. So, today we're going to be talking about the ethics of artificial intelligence, which is a topic that in and of itself should actually suck people in. And I think with many things in technology, it's incredible good, and there also can be unintended consequences. And so really thinking about what are the policies, what are the governing things that need to be in place. And we've got an awesome panel here to talk about the issues that are at stake, the responsibility, roles, and who should be playing what, and also helping set expectations. So, for us in the industry, how should we think about this, and how should we participate? So super excited to introduce our panel today. So first is Miriam Vogel. So Miriam is the president and CEO of Equal AI. Equal AI is a nonprofit organization which is really focused on reducing unconscious bias and thinking about how to apply that in the use of artificial intelligence. Really awesome work. She's joining us today from Washington, DC. So hello, all the way across the country. I'm Seattle. And has been really spending the last couple decades working in the White House and Department of Justice. And we're super excited to have her here today. Our second panelist, Natasha Crampton, who I think has one of the most interesting titles I've ever seen. She is the Chief Responsible of Artificial Intelligence Officer at Microsoft. So she is responsible for leading a team that has the AI practice of defining, figuring out the enablement, as well as the governing aspects for approaching AI in a responsible manner for Microsoft. In terms of her day-to-day, she's collaborating with everyone internally at Microsoft as well as externally around the laws, the norms, any standard that AI can be leveraged, and more importantly, in a responsible way that benefits all. So we're super thrilled to have her. And then lastly, we have Fionn Lee Madden. So she is the co-founder and COO of Fairly AI. So Fairly AI is a tool for organizations to actually audit their artificial intelligence systems, which is a super critical piece for all business units, helping to eliminate the bias, thinking about privacy, ensuring transparency. These are super critical systems as we think about how to do this in a responsible way. So before Fairly AI, she served as the technical and business leader for a bunch of Fortune 500 clients, as well as ATG before it was acquired by Oracle. So she brings a ton to the table, as well as Natasha. Miriam, super excited. Thank you guys in advance for taking the time to talk with us all today. And Molly, I think this is yours. Let's get it on.
Thanks, Dave, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to start, we're going to follow the framework as Dave outlined, starting with what's at stake, and then turning to who is responsible, and then what to expect for the year ahead. So first, Natasha, from your perspective, what does responsible AI mean, and why is it important?
Thanks, Molly. It's a pleasure to be here today. When I think about responsible AI, I'm really thinking about it as the process of coordinating the development and use of AI with core values and principles. So at Microsoft back in 2018, we adopted a set of principles that really serve as our North Star for this effort. Our principles are aligned with many other principles that you've probably seen from government and academia and industry since, and they're centered on fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. We've since been spending our time working to operationalize those principles, which is really to say we've been working to define what it means in practice to uphold our principles. And we really think about this operationalization as a core part of acting on our responsibility here and moving from what can sometimes be a bit of an abstract discussion about ethics and values to a more consistent organizational approach. So in recent times, much of the effort has been centered on building out 4 big building blocks. We have a governance structure to enable progress and accountability. We've got rules to standardize the practice of responsible AI at Microsoft. We've got training and practices to really promote a human-centered mindset, and tools and processes for implementation. Across all of those building blocks, we try to recognize that responsible AI is really both a culture and a practice. It's a culture in the sense that it's a way of thinking about how we build AI systems. It really puts humans at the center of them. And we try to get our teams to ask the tough questions, such as, why are we building this AI system? And is the technology that's at the core of the system really ready for this type of application? I think importantly though, it's responsible AI is also a practice. There are many big and small decisions that are made in the course of building an AI system. And that starts with thinking critically about the impact of the system on stakeholders, to choosing data sets and training algorithms, to designing an effective interaction between humans and an AI system. From my perspective, this work on the culture and practice of responsible AI is so important because we know that AI is one of the most transformational technologies of our time. We've seen, just even from recent memory, that it has the potential to help us with some of the biggest challenges that the world is confronting, from recovering from the pandemic in an inclusive way to climate change. But we can't achieve that potential if people don't trust the technology. To build that trust, we really need to lay the groundwork to secure the benefits as much as possible, but also anticipate and guard against where it might go wrong. Lastly, I think it's important to recognize that building AI systems is different to more traditional forms of software development. We really need the world to think not just about AI systems in a technical sense, but we need to think about them in a socio-technical sense. So this is really thinking about where the technology meets society. And there are lots of new practices and processes and tools that we really need to put in place to help guide this work.
Great, thank you, Natasha. So Miriam, turning to you now, why do we need to get this technology right? What is the opportunity for AI technology, and what are the consequences of having bias?
Thank you, Molly. I love that question, and I love this discussion because at Equal AI, we are AI net positive. We are so excited about what is going to come to our society, the opportunities for creating more equality, for creating a strong economy, for creating opportunities for people to thrive that will be established and enabled by AI. But that can only happen if we are hyper focused on ensuring that we're building it right now with the right principles that Natasha just talked about, thinking about building trust and owning that trust, making sure that there's culture and practice that is establishing this AI that will be improving our lives. So why do we have to get this right? Well, there's big ways, big and small, that AI is so impactful on our lives, from throughout the pandemic, when Netflix has entertained us with the algorithms of what show we'd like to binge watch next. Well, we want to make sure that we're being representative of who we're watching, and not just being exclusionary to certain populations, to make sure that we're being inclusive in what types of writers, productions, and studios we're representing. Well, that's one piece of it. But then think about the life and death scenarios. AI robots have helped bring people PPE and food during the pandemic. What if it's using facial recognition technology that is not able to identify features of people of color, or people using mobile devices to help them, such as wheelchairs, crutches, etc. Think of the harms to those people if we don't get that right. Think about the harms of the benefits of AI that can help improve a doctor's visit by expediting the intake process, but only if that intake can acknowledge and understand that the symptoms of a female heart attack will be different than a male's. And so that will require data sets, and that will require building algorithms that understand that data sets don't always show representative samples of various populations. Certain populations, genders, ethnicities can be underrepresented. And so, those are the key examples of where it can be so exciting, telehealth, feeding us, entertaining us, but only if we get it right, only if we understand that algorithms are opinions, and that each human touch point throughout the AI development product lifecycle is an opportunity for bias to embed, but it is also an opportunity for us to identify these various forms of harmful bias and correct them if done properly.
Thanks, Miriam. And I love that AI net positive I like that framing. Fionn, turning to you, from your perspective on the ground, what are you seeing as the real applications and impact of AI technologies as it relates to responsibility and fairness?
Hi, thank you for having me. So first of all, I want to give you kudos, Molly, for putting this panel together, because I think the whole responsible AI issue problem cannot be solved by any one of us alone. It needs to be multi-stake. Like, we need the big giant technology firm, we need people who are connected in the policy world, and we need, the innovators, startup world, which is what I'm representing on this panel. And what I'm seeing on the ground is that we're a relatively young startup. We started a year ago, and we've talked to, over 200 people up and down the organization of different sizes. We talk to AI startups, we talk to Fortune 10 companies. And really where responsible AI and fairness apply is in these screening applications, I would say, of using AI. So anytime you're using AI to screen, to make screening decisions, such as in healthcare, who gets admitted to hospital, and in financial services is your mortgage loans or credit card approval. And education is, the recent fiasco in UK, the A-level exam determining who gets to go to university. And also hiring is a very famous one example where, Amazon had a recruiting system that basically preferred men for all tech jobs. And we've learned since then that they actually have not rolled that out to production. So I know there has been a lot of hype in the media blaming Amazon, but in fact, they did catch that before it got rolled out to production. So I want to give them, kudos for that too. But yeah, it's like the fairness and responsible AI in the real world application right now is really a talk around like these applications that have, human impacts. I know there has been talks about like weapon targeting as well, using AI, and certainly those are, the scope is expanding. I think certainly those are other types of AI application where fairness can come into play. And then the other one is really the definition of AI ethics is also expanding. There's the concept of AI supply chain, where who's doing your data labeling? Is it a person in a a developing country, or third world country that is being paid really little to do it? Is that fair? Is that ethical? That has been coming to discussion as well. And then another current topic is the environmental impact of AI. Is that part of AI ethics? I think you've all read the whole fiasco at Google about Timothy Gibru, her paper on the climate impact on these large NLP training data sets. So that is all very topical when we talk about AI ethics as well. And I want to go back to what Natasha said about like operationalizing those AI ethics and principles, and that's certainly what we've seen on the ground in the last year. Is there has been over 200, maybe 300 AI principles and guidelines published in the last 2 to 3 years, and it is really within the last year, especially after Black Lives Matter. Unfortunately, that people are starting to realize, oh wait, there is AI bias. There's biases in all these algorithms we're creating, and with IBM exiting facial recognition technology, followed by Microsoft and Amazon, I think it is, again, like people are really trying to solve this problem by operationalizing some of these AI guidelines and principles in the last year.
Thank you, Fionn. That's certainly a really fascinating range of applications there. And I think that's kind of the next part of our discussion is, we start to level set on what's at stake. As folks have mentioned on this call, we're really transitioning now from really applying these principles and starting to understand who is responsible and how do we operationalize that. So Natasha, turning to you now, how do innovators and companies actually create the AI tools that are ethical and fair?
Thanks, Molly. I mean, we're fortunate at Microsoft to have leadership that recognizes that if you're going to be creating technology that changes the world, then you have a responsibility to address the world that you've helped to create. So we really start from the perspective that as an innovator, as a tech provider, we absolutely do have a responsibility to make sure that we're doing everything we can to bake our principles into our products and services and maximize the benefit of them. When it comes to fairness specifically, what we try to do is we try and think about fairness across the whole life cycle of building an AI product or service. So actually one of the first steps, which is sometimes overlooked but is critically important, is actually starting with a team that is diverse in perspectives and backgrounds to make sure that you're spotting issues that a more homogeneous team may not see. And it's also important to involve stakeholders from outside the tech industry for precisely the same reasons. As Miriam mentioned, building an AI system starts with data. It's really important to carefully curate that data and make sure that the data sets that you're pulling together actually represent the diversity of our society, because those data sets are being used to train the model that will then be used in a societal context. We do also ask our teams to make really careful choices about features and model structures. What's the objective function of the model? What is the training algorithm that's going to be used? So you can see that there are lots of very consequential decisions that are made as you're pulling together an AI system. There are also increasingly tools available to help detect and mitigate fairness issues. We've got a couple that we've made available on an open source basis. One's called FairLearn, another's called Error Analysis. But I would say that those tools are still fairly new and nascent, and we've got really work to do as an industry to build out the scope and availability of those tools so that everybody can be equipped to identify and mitigate those bias issues. Now, testing is a really, really important part of the equation here. As the tech provider, we feel it's incumbent on us to do testing in the lab, as it were, but because it's very often the case that results differ as between the lab and the real world, it's really important to also keep testing out once systems have been deployed and making sure that any emerging issues are being uncovered. We think it's also important that we are transparent about decisions that we make when we're building AI systems. One of the most interesting but also the most vexing part of fairness is that it's deeply contextual and there really is no sort of one size fits all solution. And as a consequence of that, you have to make choices along the way. And we think it's important to be transparent about those choices so that users of the technology that we make available can understand them and recognize the limitations that they place on any given system. So, just bear in mind that sort of brief overview of the life cycle of building an AI system and all the many things that need to be done there. It's true that this is a complex undertaking, and we all need to lean in as an industry to develop the state of the art. I think from a policy perspective, one of the issues that we've come to regard as a really important one is to recognize that there is this shared responsibility between developers of the technology and deployers of the technology. And both have to play their part in order to really uphold fairness. So if we take, let's just use some transparency obligations as an example. An AI developer should be transparent about the capabilities and the limitations of the technology so that users can be aware of what those are and take them into account as they're deploying the system. But the deployer of the technology is usually best placed to tell the consumer or the end user that an AI system is in use. And so with fairness, an AI developer is uniquely positioned to tackle the challenge of mitigating fairness concerns through data sets and model building. But the deployer is better placed to actually understand how the system, the finished system, could be used in ways that discriminate. So thinking through these sorts of considerations, I think, is important from a policy perspective. So we can make sure that everybody understands what they can do to contribute to the overall fairness of a system, and that we start to develop a policy environment where obligations are sort of given to the parties that are best placed to meet those expectations, and with the net result of just a fairer system overall.
Thank you, Natasha. That's a fascinating overview. And I think from the tech provider perspective, especially as we look, in addition to that perspective, Miriam, perhaps you could speak to some of the other key players in the ecosystem that contribute to this fairness and inclusivity.
With pleasure. And I think as Fionn says from the beginning, this is an all multi-stakeholder, I would say all hands on deck type of situation. I don't think we can understate the importance of the corporate creators of AI, those who are building these systems. And we're very fortunate to hear the insight from Natasha on what's happening at one of the leaders in this space, where they are going into such excruciating detail to ensure that they've got that balance, to understand where there are gaps, and to share that in a transparent way. At the end of the day, they will be, the companies who are creating the AI know where the context is, where the gaps are in their creation. And so it enables them to provide us with information on who's best served and who is not as well served. Just like a nutrition label, if you have a gluten or dairy allergy, and if the company doesn't tell you there's gluten and dairy in which are their products, you can't make that educated choice. So I really want to start by commending what Natasha talks about them doing at Microsoft, and underscore that at the end of the day, we need companies taking responsibility for their AI creation. But at that point, then there are so many other ways that we all need to participate, from the consumer. The employees are beginning to participate more and more in this process, and questioning where there are potential gaps, which is if a smart company will welcome that. They will bring in the employees as their partners in this effort to understand that when you're talking about AI, it's not just what you've baked in the nutrition label. It will have constant iterations, and it will be used in different contexts other than those originally imagined. And so a smart company will bring in the employees as partners to help them identify potential gaps, as well as your consumers. So by being transparent, as Natasha just said, you can, first of all, identify where there are potential limits and risks, but also you're making your customer your partner, and saying, we're doing our best here. We're really trying to figure this out, but we need you to help us understand where there are limits or more benefits, more opportunities. So it's also a smart competitive advantage for a company to say, let us know where to create more AI for you, to sell you more of what we're offering. And then on top of that, we have to understand at the end of the day, companies are not nonprofits. They are not governments. They are not built to simply make the world a better place. They are through their product, but they answer to shareholders, their boards. They have revenue models that they are built to supply and answer to. At the end of the day, you need government as your partner and nonprofits who are helping to establish what those guardrails are. And fortunately, we're starting to see that more and more from governments, including our own, where we're starting to see more interest and discussion about what we can expect down the road. State governments have started to try to establish those guardrails, and nonprofits, as well as startups, are showing different ways that they can be true partners in the process. I don't want to do shameless plugs, but some opportunities are, for instance, we're launching a badge program for senior executives to learn what is responsible AI governance. How do I build that in my company? Another key player is lawyers. So we've built a CLE and we're working with lawyers to make them partners in this effort. Lawyers have ABA model rules that specifically talk about developing understanding of how tech can influence their client and potential harms that can be created. And we need to start as lawyers, that's my own bias as a lawyer, supporting our clients and supporting companies and asking the hard questions that we do of any industry to understand where are their potential harms. First of all, to reduce the harm, and second of all, because there's going to be liability coming down the road through the new laws that are going to be created and through greater application of laws already on the books. So both to avoid the harms to consumers that companies do not want to be creating and to avoid the litigation and liability that is to come, lawyers also need to be a partner early in this effort while the AI is being built and deployed.
Thank you, Marian. That's, as you said, all hands on deck, really broad ecosystem approach to this challenge and opportunity. Fionn, before we kind of leave this topic of who is responsible, would love to hear from you in terms of what are some of the challenges you're seeing in terms of making sure AI is responsible?
I think both Natasha and Miriam touched upon them, like the work Miriam's doing in particular around policies and like advocacy for consumers, I think is one of the most important thing, because the challenge I'm seeing is like not every startup or applied AI startup, I would say, have the budget or resources to hire a chief responsible AI officer. So if there's no existing regulations and they can get away of not doing it, not building responsible AI, they're not doing it, is what I'm seeing on the ground today. Where we're getting the most traction from is really the tier 1 financial services company who has been, using data for decades, and they're considered one of the most AI ready adopter. And even them, they're having trouble, navigating, what is considered AI, responsible AI, and what is not. And a lot of them really fall back to existing regulations, such as, in the States, we have the Fair Lending Act, where, if you are using data and discriminate someone for their loan approval, it is against regulations already. It doesn't matter if it's an AI model or just traditional statistical model. So I think that like not having the regulations in place to force people to adopt some of these responsible AI principles is certainly a challenge we're seeing. The other one is around having, the diversity in the data science world. I think that has been mentioned in almost all the AI principles and guidelines. You need to have a diverse data science team to make sure you're not building biased AI. But in practice, that is actually very hard to do, especially as a startup, because like less than 20% of data scientists in the world are women. And even like there's a drop off like after a few years, and a lot of women, especially during COVID, have chosen not to participate in the economy. So I think the actual number is more like less than 10%. And then when we add that to, BIPOC, people in Black and indigenous community, like the percentage is even smaller. So it's really hard to hire a diverse data scientist in practice unless you're like well-funded, right? And then on the other side of the coin is that I'm female and I'm Chinese, and I can guarantee you that I have my conscious and unconscious bias. And my husband's family is from India, and I can guarantee you he has a separate set of bias. So you cannot simply say I hire people from all different countries and then you solve the bias problem, right? So that's why I think like building tools and actually like processes and frameworks to ensure that there's no biases in your AI is critical. And then the other point is really going back to the regulations, right? So there's certainly like company internal policies that are in place to help address some of these issues, especially in the large companies that we talk to. And then it's really back to the, the company, I would say less than 200 people who are, still trying to figure out what's their path for profits. And so far, responsible AI is not on top of the list. So I think there needs to be, like, in the startup world, especially if there's any VCs listening, like, they need to be part of the ecosystem too. Like, they need to say, I'm not like investing in your company if you guys are not building responsible AI.
Thanks, Fion. I'm seeing some.
Underscore that point. I feel like that's the biggest takeaway people could have if everyone followed Fion's great suggestion there. If you ask any, as an individual, but particularly as a company, if you ask the companies you're working with, have you tested for discriminatory forms of bias in your AI? Have you tested to see if you're discriminating against protected classes? If you just start there with the legal basics, I think that could be the most powerful tool as consumers, industry consumers, personal consumers. I just wanted to underscore that point as really the most powerful tool we all have at our disposal.
Thank you. I'm also seeing some great questions in the chat. Please continue to put those in. We're going to talk a little bit about what to expect here in the year ahead, and after that section, we'll turn to kind of audience Q&A. So thank you for putting those in there and keep them coming. So along those lines, we've talked a lot about some of the regulations we've recently seen in the European Union. And some of the limits that those apply to various applications of AI technologies. So Miriam, would you be able to talk a little bit about what policy regulation you think we might expect to see in the United States in the year ahead, sort of at the federal and the state level as well?
Absolutely. Well, I think everyone's taken notice of the leadership of the EU. I think we've seen that they're going to make good on their efforts as they did with GDPR. And I think that has, in addition to an awakening that's being evidenced in the U.S. government and state governments, I think we can expect to see a lot more happening. We've come a long way from the Zuckerberg hearings, where people had the impression that U.S. lawmakers don't know how to speak tech. I don't think we'll ever be in a place where it's massive populations of computer scientists on the Hill, but there's certainly been a huge inflection and infusion of tech expertise and awareness. And I think on both how to regulate to prevent harms, but also how to support innovation, how to ensure that we maintain our tech leadership in ways that are so important and exciting. So where can we see this? I think the FTC has shot across the bow of that they plan to be looking for bias in AI systems. They plan to look at whether companies have advertised in ways that they are practicing what they're preaching. Are they being representative in who they're targeting and how they're testing for bias in their AI? So they have not pulled any punches and have been clear that they'll use the full force of their power. They're also trying to grow their power in thoughtful ways through their new rules committee, their general counsel's office, the state soapbox function, which is also pretty powerful, in addition to the enforcement powers they have. I think we can expect to see CFPB leaning in on their powers. I understand at the Department of Labor, they're also being thoughtful about ways that AI is impacting labor. Now that we were moving in that direction, COVID has skyrocketed us in the direction of AI influencing the labor market, from not only hiring like we've talked about, but in employee evaluations and in termination. So throughout the employment lifecycle, many companies are using AI. I've seen reports, it was actually before COVID, that over 80% of large US companies are using AI somewhere in their HR process. So we can imagine mid-post, hopefully we're at the end of the COVID cycle, how much further along and how much higher that percentage is. We know the EEOC had at least 2 cases under review for AI in hiring, where they were investigating discrimination. So I think the agencies are really leaning in, HUD, and so forth. I think we also are seeing on the Hill great interest in ways that we have new laws in place to broaden the scope of where we are looking for bias in AI, what the expectations of companies should be, and likely a reiteration of some kind of algorithmic accountability act, where there will be requirements for audits, self audits. In that last iteration, we'll see what that would look like in the future, as well as discussion of advertising AI bias. I think they're following the headlines. They see where the journalists are uncovering harms and discrimination, and they're not overlooking it and understanding where the laws should be in place to ensure that we have those guardrails. In the meantime, like you said, the states are stepping up. We saw New York City issue a detailed report about where it's using its own AI, which I think is really exciting. We wrote an article in TechCrunch about some of the most important things that the government can be doing right now, the Biden administration. And 2 of the most important levers are their own use of AI, putting a governance structure in place, thinking about their procurement process and how that can be one of the most powerful tools, considering all the companies that they touch through their procurement and their internal use, and setting a model as a leader in how to govern as a responsible AI user or builder to the extent that they're building as well, and in how they're going to investigate. If they could be clear on how the agencies will be investigating their AI use and making sure there's clear applicability to laws on the books, that will be another really important development. But again, back to the states, we saw Washington pass a law on facial recognition and really lead a host of other states and cities that have followed in that direction. An Illinois law on use of AI in employee video interviews, which again set a new trend. California law on governing when you're using a chatbot to put a user on notice, that is how they're communicating. They're communicating with a computer. And throughout the states, I think that we're seeing ramping up of similar legislation along those lines.
Thanks, Miriam. I think it's a fascinating and comprehensive overview, and pretty clear that we are shifting, from starting to understand it to really putting these regulations into practice. So Natasha, I'd love to kind of hear your perspective. Microsoft is a global leader, but also based here in Washington. And at the WTIA, we're certainly very fortunate to partner with Microsoft on policy issues and learn from your expertise. And we've seen many regulations on AI in Olympia and at the city and state level or county level here. Could you provide some context for some of the regulatory issues we're seeing here in Washington?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to this group that we've got, much innovation happening here in Washington State, and therefore much innovation happening in Olympia and other centers around Washington where new laws and regulations are being made. I think probably the most prominent discussion here in Washington State is the one that Miriam referred to, which is around facial recognition technology. At the state level, there are at least 2 legislative sessions where facial recognition came up for debate, and there was a full spectrum of proposals from bans and moratoria to, many other more specific types of regulation as well. But the legislature did actually adopt a law back in March 2020 that in many senses is the first of its kind to regulate government use of facial recognition. Microsoft was a supporter of this law, and it's going to come into effect in about a month's time in July. I think there's a couple of important parts of this law that are worth talking about, because I think we'll see them crop up in other contexts that are analogous to facial recognition as part of this trend that Miriam was alluding to about, regulators and lawmakers really awakening to some of the risks of this technology, the need to put in place these guardrails to make sure that those benefits are realized. I think one of the important parts of the Washington State facial recognition legislation is that it does have that sort of detailed transparency and accountability up front. So actually, a government agency looking to use the technology has to file a notice of intent before they even start to use the technology. And there are several sort of accountability gates that they would need to move throughout the course of using the technology, which importantly includes a public consultation process. There are also some really specific civil liberties protections, including protections against mass surveillance, prohibitions on uses that would violate First Amendment rights. So that would be using facial recognition to surveil a protest without a good cause. Also safeguards for criminal trials. And I think this is really important, making sure that those who have been identified using facial recognition technology actually are made aware of that fact and can choose to challenge that in the course of a trial if need be. The requirements in the Washington state law around third-party testing of facial recognition technology, I think, have broad application and are just interesting for sort of foreboding, I think, what's to come. They require technology providers such as Microsoft to actually build our technology in a way that allows third-party testing, that sort of allows that independent scrutiny of how well the technology is performing. And I can say this from Microsoft's very own experience, that third-party testing is a very good way to shine a light on challenges that we may not have seen ourselves and really, drive action as a consequence of that. And, we're seeing that not just with Microsoft, but with other providers as well. I think beyond facial recognition, we've seen several sort of algorithmic accountability type bills being put forward in Washington state. So just broadly speaking, this type of legislation really requires government agencies to undertake impact assessments of the use of automated decision systems and produce things like algorithmic reports, accountability reports, before they actually adopt these systems. Agencies would need to notify users that they are being subject to an AI system. There'd need to be audits. There'd need to be safeguards to ensure that legal rights are not being impacted. And also, I think critically, to be able to explain the basis for any decision. So you can imagine a situation where, a government agency is using an AI system to help predict someone's access to a healthcare program and whether they really sort of meet the criteria for that program or a benefit, for example. It's really important that we provide users with transparency into the basis for those decisions being made against them so that they're empowered to challenge those decisions. And it's just a way of building trust in the system, which I think is really important. There's also another really interesting piece of legislation in Olympia a couple of legislative sessions ago, which was about algorithmic profiling. And this is really an issue that you've seen enter the mainstream press in recent times. So this bill actually sought to prohibit the use of AI to determine a person's state of mind and character and propensities, etc. It also had a sort of corresponding prohibition on using those sorts of profiling profiling abilities to make high stakes decisions without the intervention of humans. So I think these proposals are all very interesting ones. I think, we should all recognize and be humble about the fact that regulation in this space is new and it's hard, and laws that have been passed still have opportunities for, further discussion and to build on those foundations. And I think going forward, we just should approach the policy changes that we need in this space mindful of two really important points. The first is that, as you heard from Miriam, there's already a huge range of existing laws that apply to this space. And we should make sure that those laws are enforced, and we should understand where they apply and where they don't, and where the gaps are. Because I think the better the understanding that we have of specific problems that we are trying to regulate for and drive certain policy outcomes, the better the job that we're going to do, because it really allows us to calibrate the safeguards and make sure that they are in fact actually leading to the policy outcomes that we want. And the second point is just one that you've heard multiple times in this discussion, which is that it is absolutely critical that everybody has a seat at the table when it comes to these policy making processes. Through some of these laws, we're really making societal choices about what we want our future to look like. And so it's critically important that we have civil society, impacted communities, regulators, industry, academia at the table and having those conversations with one another. Because although we might be approaching those conversations to begin with from completely different angles, through that process of dialogue and seeking to drive policy outcomes, I think we're just going to get to a much better law overall. And so it's really critically important that we focus on that piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Thanks so much, Natasha. I think that's a really excellent overview of a lot of very complicated policy efforts here in Washington, and how, as you said, kind of identifying those gaps and calibrating the solutions accordingly is going to be so important. I have one final question for each of the panelists before we get to audience Q&A. I would love to hear from you guys in terms of what is your favorite application of AI technology? What makes you most excited about AI? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. It's a bit like asking who's your favorite child, but I like to put the two application domains, I would say, for AI forward to answer this question. First is in healthcare. I mean, I think we've seen, even just in recent memory, how vast and hard and expansive the challenges are that we have in healthcare. And so, there are very many particular applications of AI that I could point to, but, a couple that I think are really exciting and promising is that we're working with a group called Folding at Home on this distributed computing project out of Washington University in St. Louis. And there we're really trying to understand the relationship between proteins and diseases to accelerate therapeutic treatments. And that has actually proven to be helpful in the context of COVID-19. In the second bucket, I would put the use of AI to address the very real sustainability and climate challenges that we have ahead of us. So we've done a bit of work with an organization called Sylvia Terra to use satellite imagery to run AI over to understand the situation with forests in ways that would be very expensive and very manual and very time consuming to do. So it's really allowing us to get information that we can then use, governments and conservationists and landowners can use to better manage their forests and make more sustainable choices going forward.
Those are two great applications, and I do try to remind my mom I am her favorite child, but I think it's two good options right there. Miriam or Fionn, do you have one that gets you particularly excited?
Which child? I think, healthcare is definitely the area where there's the most promise and potential harm. We're seeing weekly new advances in cancer identification. I just think it's just a game changer when the AI system that can take in more data than most of us could read in a lifetime and interpret it in such powerful and impactful ways to help us screen and more early detect cancer in times when there's more opportunity to treat it. Again, it's with the caveat that we are clear on where the limitations are at both in the algorithms and particularly in the data sets to know where there'd be a false negative, most importantly. But I think also talking about favorite children, I'm really excited about the way that AI during COVID has helped my daughters advance. I have an untraditional background to coming into AI as a lawyer and someone who worked in bias in government, as Dave mentioned. But really the motivator for me was trying to get my daughters to be able to understand, to be tech literate, and all the barriers that I hit in our own school system and in our own current limitations in society. And I'm very excited about the newest members of our family, including Roblox. And there are certainly challenges, but so many benefits that my daughters can now create games with their friends and take pride in their creations that we really celebrate.
I mean, I completely agree with what Natasha and Miriam said, and to add a different flavor, and it's similar to what Miriam said about Roblox, but it's the idea of using AI for personalized education. I mean, I have two young child, one is 7, one is 10, and I consciously brought them up the same way. Unconsciously, I only bought my daughter her first set of Lego when she was 5. And I didn't realize it. My son got his first set of Lego probably when he was like 2. So there's that conscious and unconscious bias. But what I like about like using AI for personalized education, especially for actually people of all ages, like you've seen like apps for languages, for math, you know, especially during COVID time, everything's done online. Like I feel like the AI definitely does a better job of knowing where the gaps are and help them achieve. I think the main thing for the young child is the confidence that they needed. They don't have a standardized testing that says if you doesn't understand 10 plus 1 equals 11, your career ended. And that's the system I was brought up in Hong Kong, right? If you don't know your ABCs by the age of 3, you have no future, right? Basically. So I feel like I grew up in a very rigid education system, and I do see there's a lot of benefit and using AI to do the personalized education where not everyone needs to learn the ABC by 3.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to look at a few of the questions here for the chat. We have about 6 minutes left. I see a question from Ed, who's one of my favorite question askers, so I'll start with that. The facial recognition technology prohibition speeding through the Seattle City Council goes too far, in my view. AI and human is typically better than either AI alone or human alone. There are serious ethical fairness issues related to AI. How do we raise awareness of these without stimulating policymakers to go overboard?
I'll jump in on that one in the first instance. I think it's a great question. My own experience has been that it's useful to bring groups together and have these multi-stakeholder conversations in respect of specific use cases where we can talk about tangible ways in which the technology may be deployed and how things can go well and how things can go wrong in the context of particular use cases. Because sometimes when you're having conversations about these really tricky, sometimes very personal topics at a sort of high level, it's easy to sort of find yourselves moving further away from one another as opposed to coming towards one another. But sometimes when you dig into specific use cases and you strip away those moments where you might be talking past one another because you're using a slightly different terminology or we don't have the same sort of shared understanding of the facts, then that can be counterproductive to progress. I would say, it is important to try and have those more concrete discussions, and after sort of considering a number of different use cases, you can often generalize out, but I think it is useful to take that approach. The second thing I'll just say is that I think, that transparency dimension of achieving fairness is pretty important. I think it does build trust and confidence when, NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, is running, a rigorous testing regime that, maybe not perfect in all respects, but it provides an important benchmark for this type of technology. And, there should, I think, be increasing sort of public outreach and kind of capacity building to try and understand those sorts of benchmarks and really translate them into what do they mean on a day-to-day basis, because sometimes I think they still can be a little hard to grok and understand unless you're a statistician or an expert in computer vision, which is not what we want, right? I think trying to get to transparent approaches to fairness that is sort of readily understandable without being an expert in the space is a good way of kind of stripping away some of the rhetoric and really trying to have, you know, a discussion that's based on, you know, the current state of the art as verified by third parties.
Thank you, Natasha. We have time for one last question. One of the earlier questions, yeah, I assume gender bias is not the only type of bias out there. What types of biases do you normally encounter? Are there any variations in the strengths of these biases which you actually detected?
I'm happy to start off. I'm so glad that's asked, because I think it's often misunderstood that when we're talking about bias in AI, people seem to think you're talking about one population. There's no end to the populations that could be underrepresented depending on the data sets, depending on the product you're talking about. We've seen it as gender discrimination, some of the examples we gave, race-based discrimination, and that you see that a lot in both the facial recognition conversation we've been having. And again, when we're talking about discrimination, it's not necessarily intentional. I mean, that's the problem here. It's implicit. It's not having looked at the data set for a certain representation. It's not having enough people who are testing the product of different populations. You see it in age. You see it in geography, misunderstanding dialects, in voice recognition. There's a real challenge in understanding both those with speech impediments and those who speak different dialects. So those are just a few more, but I'm really glad someone clarified or asked us to clarify here that we're talking about so many different ways that there can be harmful bias in AI. And in terms of the strength, it really, I would say, depends on what application you're talking about. And so, you know, we've talked about in facial recognition, the significant harm to users of color where their facial features were not as readily detected. If you're talking about the criminal justice system, the examples we've seen with the Compass AI program, a sentencing tool, as well as population for police aiding. We haven't gotten into it, so I'm sorry to bring up these examples at the end, but for variety of criminal justice AI applications, we've seen race and population-based discrimination and outcomes. In health, we've seen age, gender, race, ethnicity, you know, all sorts of harms pop up when untested and not identified in advance.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for joining. You know, we're really fortunate to have you join us here for an hour of your time. It's a tremendous conversation and critically important, both here in Washington and at the federal level. Washington is really a hub for AI innovation. I see many, you know, AI company CEOs on the call right now, and we're really lucky to hear from you about some of these important implications and what we can expect in the year ahead. So thank you so much. If we were live, we would all applause right now, and but we'll just have to end the Zoom call. Thank you so much.